"You're early." That's all my mother said when she opened the door. No hug, no smile, just a flat glance, a tight voice, and a judgment wrapped in a cardigan. Her eyes dropped to my boots before they ever reached my face. "Make sure to leave your boots outside," she said, already turning. Not even the polished brass buttons on my dress uniform could hold her gaze. That uniform has seen war, carried blood, sweat, and grit. It's kept people alive. But in this house, it's just another thing that doesn't fit the decor. My name is Rachel Monroe. I'm 36 years old, a former combat medic turned trauma instructor at Walter Reed. I've stitched lives back together in bomb craters, breathed through gasps of dying boys, and carried more pain than any textbook could teach. But here, back in this house, I'm not a medic, not a soldier, not even a daughter. I'm just a presence they'd rather not explain, a name they hardly say out loud. Thanksgiving. Oh, that's how my mother welcomed me home for Christmas, no less. I've grown used to it over the years. It never changes. But I didn't come back for the turkey or the lights or the promises of peace wrapped in holiday pies. I came back because somewhere deep down I still wonder if I stood at that door in this uniform, with everything I've become stitched into its fabric, would they finally see me? Not the girl they expected. Not the daughter they've kept silent for years. Just me. I came back because even after war and blood and dust and the echoes of screams, no one at this table has ever heard some small part of me still craves something that simple. A name card that says my name. Rachel, not Sergeant, not her. Just Rachel. I stood on the porch, one hand still on my duffel, wondering if I'd made a mistake coming. Again. The porch light flickered overhead, the same way it did 20 years ago when I was sneaking out to read anatomy books under the stars. Nothing changes here except me. And somehow, that's the problem. "Come in," she said, already turning back inside like hosting me was part of a checklist she couldn't skip. The house smelled like cinnamon, an artificial peace. The air was thick with everything unsaid. I stepped inside the door, clicking shut behind me, like a lock sealing off any chance of being understood. "You're not on active duty anymore," my father said as he came around the corner. "You can wear civilian clothes, you know." No hello, no welcome back. Just the same message, different voice. "You're too much, too loud, too different." I looked at him. Still tall, still commanding, still disappointed. He handed me a glass of water I hadn't asked for and walked away. Then came Liam. 6 feet of tailored charm hair, perfectly in place smile, rehearsed and ready. My older brother, the one who never failed. "Still playing army girl, huh?" He grinned, clapping my shoulder like I was some intern at his firm. Still playing mama's boy. I almost replied, but didn't. Instead, I smiled. Thin. Controlled. Dinner was already set. A long table dressed in cream and gold, every fork aligned, every wine glass full. My name card didn't say Rachel. It said Sergeant R. Monroe. I stared at it for a long time. Not at the gold embossed lettering or the elegant design, but at that name, Sergeant R. Monroe. 4 syllables that said everything they never dared to. Not Rachel, not daughter, not sister, just a rank sergeant, Rachel Monroe. I muttered to myself, well, at least they didn't abbreviate the whole thing. I took my seat next to an empty chair. Symbolic, maybe, or just convenient. The conversation flowed like a river I wasn't meant to step into. Mum talked about Pilates. Dad talked about golf. Liam, of course, talked business. A new startup, VC money, 6 figures before the second round of turkey. I waited for a lull, just one opening. Last year, I began. I was stationed near Aleppo. We came across a village hit by mortar fire. I found a girl, Jasmine. She was 7, lost both parents, broken ribs, internal bleeding. I carried her 2 miles through rubble and sniper zones to a makeshift aid post. I could still see her face so small, pale, trying to smile through pain. She held on to me like, "Let's not talk about bombs at the dinner table," my mother cut in, dabbing her napkin to her lips. "Must you always bring up these dramatic war tales? It's Thanksgiving, not story hour," she said. Next, my father said, "Besides, I thought medics stayed behind the line. You make it sound like you were storming Normandy." Liam mocked, "Next, you'll tell us you dragged 3 grown men on your back through a burning building. Come on, Rach, you were trained to assist, not be some action hero." To them, my reality is a punchline. My pain a plot hole in their sanitized version of who they need me to be. I just don't understand why you always have to be the center of the room, always proving something. It's exhausting. My father said, "And let's not forget you chose this. No one forced you to sign up for blood and bombs. If you're miserable, that's on you." Liam: "Honestly, if you'd gone into dental hygiene like Mum suggested, you wouldn't be dealing with internal bleeding and sniper zones." I didn't bring it up for praise. I said. My mother cut in, "You brought it up to be seen, like always." I stared at the cranberry sauce. It looked like a wound. They didn't hear Jasmine's breathing hitch. They didn't smell scorched hair. They only hear noise when I speak. Because I disrupt the pretty script. Because I don't fit. The room silence. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I've learned that in this house, explanations are just confessions no one asked for. Later, after pie and polite tension, I stepped outside. Same backyard, same patchy grass, same plastic chairs stacked by the shed. I stood under the stars what little I could see through the suburban haze. My breath fogged in the cold. I listened to the laughter from inside warm, easy exclusive. And I thought, I came here looking for something I already built without them. Not approved, not applause. Just to be seen. But here I am, not a war hero. I'm not a teacher, not a medic, not even a woman who has held life in one hand and death in the other. I am the daughter who never wore dresses, who never married, who brings silence instead of stories, who shows up in boots and they call me early, as if my very arrival throws everything off. I didn't cry. I just watched my breath disappear into the night, like I do every time I come back here. It wasn't always this way, or maybe it was, and I just didn't have the words for it as a child. I used to think families were puzzles and I was just the piece cut wrong, too sharp around the edges, too square for their round expectations. When I was 8, I begged for a screwdriver set for Christmas. Not a toy, one real tools. I wanted to take apart the toaster, fix the vacuum, and understand how the world hummed beneath its polished surfaces. My mother gave me a pink ballet tutu instead. "Girls like you should be graceful," she said, smoothing the tulle like it could somehow correct me. I wore it once to class, tripped during play A and got laughed at by the entire room. I never went back. Instead, I cut up the tutu to wipe grease off the lawnmower I took apart behind the shed. My brother Liam got a telescope, a chemistry set, a microscope that sat in the centre of the dining room for weeks like a trophy. He didn't even like science, but he was the curious one. I was just distracting. When he made the honour roll, there was a banner on the garage door. When I brought home straight A's, "That's what we expect from you, Rachel. No celebration, no framed certificate, just expectation already priced in." At 10, I won a regional robotics contest. My team built a prosthetic hand using salvaged electronics. My father didn't show up at the award ceremony. When I handed him the medal that night, he glanced at it, nodded once and said, "Just don't get cocky." It wasn't that they were cruel. They just didn't know what to do with me. Everything about me felt inconvenient. I liked bugs. I memorized anatomy charts. I stayed up late taking apart radios from the neighbour's junk pile. "Don't get too dirty," my mother would chide, handing me nail polish like it could fix whatever was wrong. My father once muttered, "You think you're smart, but nobody likes a girl who talks like a man." He said it like a warning. I heard it like a wall. Liam, on the other hand, was the golden thread in the family tapestry. By junior year, he was the quarterback, prom king, early acceptance to Stanford. Our fridge was a shrine to his success. Clippings, photos, printed emails. My photos in a shoebox under my bed. At 15, I sat them down. I told them I wanted to be a combat medic. Not a nurse, not a lab tech, a frontline responder. I explained what they do, how they operate in chaos, how they save lives under fire. My father laughed, not cruelly dismissively. "You mean like a soldier?" "Come on, Rachel." My mother didn't laugh, she just tilted her head. "Maybe you should look into cosmetology or dental hygiene. Something safer. Something practical." "Practical," I repeated. "Like fixing arteries while dodging bullets isn't practical enough." "You're being dramatic," she said. But it wasn't drama. It was the clearest I'd ever been. After that, Sunday dinners felt like performances in a play I hadn't auditioned for. Evelyn would comment on my posture. Gregory would ask when I was going to date someone serious. Liam would chuckle like I was some quirky side character in his coming-of-age story. So I stopped talking. At 17, I ate my meals in silence. At 18, I applied to the army without telling anyone. There was no announcement, no drama, no tears. Just a form printed from the school library, signed in blue ink and left on the kitchen counter between a grocery list and a coupon for dry cleaning. My room was spotless. My bed is made. No note. No goodbye. The recruiter picked me up at dawn. The sky was still pink when we drove past my old school. I didn't look back. My phone stayed silent for days. No text, no call. Liam posted a photo of himself in a tailored blazer that morning. "Off to New York for internship day, 187 likes." The only acknowledgement came a week later. A text from Liam. Why though? I stared at those two words for a long time. Why though? As if I needed a reason beyond the ache of never being enough. They didn't come to my boot camp graduation. They didn't send a card. The army gave me a uniform, a purpose, and more bruises than I could count, but for the first time I felt like I belonged somewhere. Not because it was easy, but because I chose it. Because no one handed it to me. Because I had to earn every inch. And because maybe becoming someone the world underestimated was the only way to survive being the girl my family never really saw. Boot camp wasn't designed to break me, but it tried. They yelled louder at the women, timed us harsher, made us run laps if one of us failed, even if the men didn't. I learned fast not to be the slowest, not to be the softest, and definitely not to cry. The first time someone called me Barbie with a bandage, I smiled so tightly my molars ached. I wasn't there to correct them. I was there to outlast them. My bunkmate threw up on day 2. Another girl quit after we had to drag a 200-pound dummy through barbed wire in the rain. I stayed quiet. I tied knots in silence, patched wounds on dummies. In silence, recited anatomy in my head like a prayer. I bled into my socks and didn't report it. I learned how to apply pressure to a wound with one hand and return fire with the other. And every night I'd lie in bed and remember the look on my mother's face when I told her my plan, the polite horror like I'd confessed to a crime. That look fueled me more than any protein bar they issued. My first deployment was Afghanistan. The mountains looked like bones pushing through the earth. Dust coated everything: your skin, your breath, your soul. I remember thinking the air itself felt angry. I'd been there 2 weeks when it happened. An IED hit the convoy ahead of ours. The sound wasn't just loud, it was wrong. A sound that made your organs clench. We ran toward the smoke. The med bag was heavier than I expected, or maybe I was still too green. I found him sprawled near a scorched Humvee Private First Class David Alvarez. 19. half a leg gone shrapnel in his side, crying and cursing in turns. "Don't let me die," he begged. I dropped to my knees. There was so much blood it looked black under the sun. I clamped a tourniquet around the stump, shoved gauze into his side, kept my hand pressed against his chest, like I could hold the life inside him with sheer will. "Stay with me," I said over and over. He gripped my sleeve, eyes wild. "Don't tell my mom," he whispered. "Please, don't tell her it was bad." His voice cracked like something sacred. I didn't tell him everything would be fine. I didn't lie. I just held on, just held. When the medevac came, I rode with him, hand still on his chest. He passed out halfway to base. I didn't realize I'd been crying until I tasted salt. That night, I sat under the tent flap away from the others. I looked at my hand still red, still shaking, and thought about what my father would say if he saw me. "You signed up for it, probably. What did you expect?" I expected fear. I expected chaos. I didn't expect to feel that kid's breath against my palm and know with a terrifying certainty that it was up to me. That I was the line between living and not. And I couldn't cry, not where they could see. Because if I cried, they'd be right. The ones who said I couldn't do it. The ones who said I was too soft, too small, too female. So I swallowed the sob. Pressed it down like a wound I didn't have time to treat. From then on, I moved like glass under pressure. Precise. I memorized every piece of gear by weight and feel. I could insert a chest tube with my eyes closed. I could block out screaming. I stopped shaking when the ground shook. I learned the rhythm of war, the way breath slows under fire, how to recognize the silence before the shot. And every time I saved someone, I imagined mailing the blood-soaked gauze home to Evelyn with a note. Still think this isn't real enough? I didn't, of course. Because this wasn't about proving her wrong. It was about becoming someone who didn't need her to be right. But even warriors have their moments, their breaking points disguised as breakthroughs. Mine came in Fallujah. We'd been stationed on the outskirts, running routine med-evac drills and resupply drops. But nothing about that day was routine. A convoy of civilians had gotten lost, diverted by a collapsed checkpoint and stumbled into a kill zone. We got the call at 14:07. By 14:10, we were moving. By 14:15, it was hell. I remember the smell first. Smoke. Metal. A kind of heat that didn't come from the sun. It rose from the ground itself, from panic, from fire, from fear. Bullets cracked through the air like a percussion section gone mad. A mortar exploded somewhere too close, sending dust and debris into the sky like it was trying to block out God. I was moving through it as low-focus scanning for movement when I saw her. A girl, maybe 10, curled beside a shattered produce cart. One arm stretched out limp and smeared with ash, her skin too pale under all that dust. But her chest was moving. Beside her was a smaller bundle, wrapped in torn cloth. Still. Too still. "Do not engage," came the command through static. "Do not approach civilians, unknown threats. Wait for air support." I heard it. I registered it. And then I ignored it. Because there are moments when rules serve survival and others when they serve silence. And I had no interest in being silent. I sprinted, not gracefully, not tactically, like a sister running to a burning bedroom. My boots slipped on blood. Something sharp sliced across my thigh. But I made it to her. I dropped to my knees and checked the girl's pulse. Weak, but there. A fracture in her right arm, maybe ribs too. She stirred lips moving soundlessly. I unwrapped the bundle. A baby boy, unconscious. Blue around the mouth. My hands moved without thought, 2 fingers to the neck, listening, praying. He was alive. Faintly. My comms were garbage. Static and ghost voices. I yelled coordinates marked with my GPS. No confirmation. I wrapped the baby in my flak jacket, tucked him against my chest, and lifted the girl in both arms. She whimpered but didn't fight. I ran. I have no idea how far. Just walls, alleys, rubble. A fireball erupted behind me, but I didn't turn. My arms burned, my side throbbed. My heart was a sledgehammer in my ears. We made it to a safe house. 2 stunned Marines took the kids from me. I collapsed before I could say their names. I woke up in a field hospital. Fluorescence overhead. My side was bandaged, a pain like lightning behind my eyes. The nurse said I had a mild concussion, a fractured rib and 22 stitches across my flank. But there was someone waiting to see me. I expected an officer, a medic supervisor, maybe even a reprimand. But it was her, the girl. She stood at the curtain's edge, one arm in a sling, a small figure in borrowed clothes. Her hair had been washed, her eyes still large, still too, knowing met mine. She stepped forward and held out her hand. In it, a lollipop, red, melted at the edges. For you, she said softly in the kind of English that children learn from cartoons and kindness. Then she looked at me, really looked, the way no one in my family ever had, not searching for faults, not worth weighing. You are brave, just that, not thank you, not you saved me, not you're amazing, brave. And something inside me cracked, not a break, a release. I cried, not the gasping sobs of grief or pain, the slow, heavy kind, the kind you don't realize you've been holding in for a decade, the kind that leaks from the corners of your eyes like a secret finding its way out. She didn't look away. She didn't flinch. She just sat beside my bed and peeled another lollipop quietly, like we were sharing a secret the world couldn't touch. That night, I didn't dream about war. I dreamed about a kitchen table and my name on a card that said Rachel and someone asking me how my day was. But when I woke up, the only thing on the tray was a note, folded in half. No name. Just a child's handwriting that said, I saw you. It was the first time I ever felt known. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, nestled between a credit card offer and a flyer for a local car wash. Its weight was unremarkable, but the handwriting on the front precise practiced was unmistakably my mother's. The return address confirmed it, the Monroe residence still standing like a monument to curated perfection in suburban Maryland. I opened it with the same caution I'd used to disarm a landmine. Inside was an invitation to Liam's wedding. Cream-coloured cardstock, embossed lettering, and a gold foil border that screamed affluence. But what caught my eye was the salutation, Sergeant R. Monroe. No Rachel, no sister. Just my rank and last name, as if I were a distant acquaintance rather than family. I stared at it, a bitter smile forming. Even in celebration, they managed to remind me of my place, or lack thereof. The military title felt less like recognition and more like a barrier, a way to keep me at arm's length. I placed the invitation on my kitchen counter, next to a stack of medical journals and a half-empty cup of coffee. The juxtaposition felt apt, a life built on saving others, contrasted with a family that barely acknowledged my existence. For days I avoided thinking about the wedding, but the envelope lingered in my periphery, a silent challenge. I found myself recalling moments from my deployment's times when I faced danger head-on when hesitation could mean death. Compared to that, attending a wedding seemed trivial. Yet, emotionally, it felt more daunting. One evening, I sat on my couch, the invitation in hand, and made a decision. I would go, not for them, but for me, to assert my presence, to reclaim my narrative. I retrieved my dress uniform from the closet, inspecting it meticulously. Each medal, each insignia told a story, a testament to battles fought and lives saved. I polished my boots until they gleamed ironed every crease to perfection. This wasn't just attire, it was armour. As I prepared, memories of Jasmine surfaced, the young girl I'd rescued in Fallujah. Her whispered words, "You are brave," echoed in my mind. She had seen me, truly seen me, in a way my family never had. That memory fortified me. On the day of the wedding, I stood before the mirror adjusting my uniform. The reflection staring back was of a woman forged in adversity, resilient and unyielding. I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and whispered to myself, "This is for you." I stepped out the sun, casting a warm glow illuminating the path ahead. With each stride, I felt a mix of apprehension and resolve. This wasn't just about attending a wedding. It was about confronting the past, standing tall amidst those who had tried to diminish me. As I approached the venue, the grandeur of the setting was evident. Manicured lawns, ornate decorations, and guests adorned in designer attire. I walked through the crowd, their conversations, momentarily halting as they took in my presence. Some eyes widened in surprise, others narrowed in judgment. But I held my head high, each step a declaration I am here, and I will not be ignored. Inside, the atmosphere was a blend of celebration and scrutiny. I navigated the room, exchanging curt nods, my uniform drawing both admiration and disdain. When I finally faced my family, their reactions were a mix of shock and discomfort, but I remained composed, offering a polite smile. Throughout the ceremony, I observed, absorbing every detail. The vows, the toasts, the laughter, all elements of a world I'd been excluded from. But instead of feeling alienated, I felt empowered. I had carved my own path, one marked by courage and conviction. As the evening progressed, I found solace in brief conversations with a few open-minded guests. Some expressed genuine interest in my experiences, offering a refreshing contrast to the usual indifference. These interactions, though fleeting, reaffirmed my decision to attend. By the end of the night, as I prepared to leave, I paused to take one last look at the gathering. The music, the chatter, the clinking of glasses all continued unabated. But I felt a sense of closure. I had faced the very people who had once made me feel invisible, and I had done so on my terms. Stepping into the cool, night air, I felt a weight lift. The journey ahead remained uncertain, but I knew one thing for sure: I had reclaimed my story, and no one could take that away from me. That certainty unravelled by morning. The text came while I was still in my hotel robe, sipping bitter coffee and watching sunlight crawl across the cheap, patterned carpet. A ping. A familiar number. My mother. If possible, don't wear the uniform to the reception. Some guests might feel uncomfortable. Uncomfortable. The irony burned hotter than the coffee. My gear had kept men alive under mortar fire. My boots had stepped through blood, fire, and hell. And yet, chiffon and champagne couldn't coexist with the fabric that carried those stories. I stared at the message for a full minute, not blinking, just letting the words smother the part of me that still wanted to believe she meant well. Then I turned off the screen. At the venue, an absurdly overdone winery with string lights wrapped around every tree like they were gifts from God, no one said anything at first. The valet nodded. The coordinator smiled like she'd been trained to. I walked through the entrance like any other guest. But I wasn't any other guest. People stared. Not openly. That would be rude. But the glances were there, darted over champagne glasses, whispered into sequined shoulders. One woman near the bar said, oh, my, and touched her pearls. Another whispered to her husband, "Do you think she's like on duty right now? I pass them like wind through silk." The room itself was glowing with curated elegance. Ivory drapes, polished mahogany floors, candles flickering in geometric glass holders. Every seat had a personalised menu with Liam and his new bride's names in gold calligraphy. I found my seat a back corner near the kitchen door. Of course, my mother found me before I could sit. Her expression was tight, like someone trying to smile through a dental procedure. "You didn't get my message," I did. A pause, and you chose to ignore it. No, I said, voice even. I chose not to erase myself. She adjusted her bracelet a nervous tick she probably thought looked elegant. It's Liam's day, Rachel. I don't want people talking. They already are, I said, and they were going to no matter what I wore. She opened her mouth, then closed it. I'm not here to make a scene, I added. I'm here to stand in the truth of who I am. That made her blink. She always hated it when I talked like I was giving a speech. Just try not to be too visible, she whispered before walking away. The irony of that nearly made me laugh. An hour later, while making small talk with a woman in lavender silk, her husband approached and asked, So, military, huh? What kind of doctor are you? I was tired of softening the truth. So, I told it plainly. The kind who holds pressure on an artery with one hand and aims an M4 with the other. He blinked, then laughed too loudly. You're joking, right? I didn't blink. I'm not. And suddenly, he remembered something important across the room and walked away. I stood there sipping ginger ale, watching him disappear into a sea of people who'd never carried another human being's pulse in their hands, who'd never had to decide whether to stay and fight or leave someone behind, who would never understand that my uniform wasn't a costume. It was a narrative stitched in loss and loyalty. I was the wrong kind of impressive, not palatable, not polished, not a surgeon with a Yale degree and a foundation in Haiti. I was messy, real, functional, under fire, and in this room that made me terrified. A group of Liam's co-workers formed a circle near the dance floor. They didn't say a word to me, but I could feel the air shift every time I got close, like I was a storm cloud in their climate-controlled evening. Eventually, even Liam found me. He clapped a hand on my shoulder just like old times. You didn't have to go full soldier, Rach, he said with a grin. I didn't go full anything, I replied. This is just me. He nodded, looked away. Just saying. It's a wedding, not a war zone. But to me, they were always the same. Crowds, noise, expectations. People pretending to see you while actually looking through you. I stayed for the cake because leaving early would have been conceding something I hadn't agreed to give. But I didn't smile in the photos. I didn't toast. I didn't cry during the first dance. I just stood there like a flag that refused to lower, in a room that only wanted centerpieces, not signals. They wanted peace. But I'd never been peace. I was proof. And sometimes that's the most uncomfortable thing of all. Which is why, when the ballroom doors opened and the hush fell like a curtain dropping mid-scene, I knew something was different. It wasn't the hush of disapproval or discomfort that I was used to. This was the kind of silence that arrives with authority, with history, with a name you don't expect to hear announced over clinking glasses and wedding playlists. Ladies and gentlemen, the event coordinator said, her voice unusually tight. We have a guest joining us briefly. Please welcome the President of the United States. The oxygen seemed to vanish from the room. Glasses paused mid-air. Jaws slackened. And there he was, older than his photos. Yes, but radiating the quiet command of someone who's had to make decisions that reshape worlds. I didn't understand why he was here, not until his eyes scanned the room and landed on me. Not until he started walking past financiers, lawyers, influencers in designer gowns, until he stood in front of the woman in uniform seated near the kitchen door. Sergeant Monroe, he said, extending his hand, I've been wanting to meet you. My breath caught. I stood slowly, boots steady against marble. Sir, I replied, accepting his handshake. His grip was firm, respectful, not patronizing, not performative. Your work in Fallujah, he continued loud enough for the surrounding crowd to hear, didn't just save lives. It changed our entire medevac response protocol. We've retrained 3 battalions based on your field decisions. That kind of impact, it rewrites doctrine. Behind me, silverware clinked against porcelain. A gasp. I didn't turn to see whose. You didn't just hold the line, he said, still holding my gaze. You moved it, for all of us. My mouth was dry. I nodded, managing a soft, "Thank you, sir." "No," he said. "Thank you." He stepped back, gave me a small salute, simple, clean, and then turned to leave. The room was frozen as if afraid to breathe in case reality shattered. I sat back down, my hands trembling slightly on my lap, and that's when I heard it, the soft clatter of glass hitting tile. I looked up. Evelyn stood near the centre table, hand to her mouth. A wine flute shattered at her feet. Her expression was unreadable, a war between pride, confusion, and something else, grief maybe, for the version of me she never got to know. Liam across the room looked like he'd swallowed a mouthful of sand. His bride whispered something to him, but he didn't respond. He just stared. I didn't smile, I didn't smirk, I didn't even blink. I just breathed, like I was finally allowed to. The kind of breath you take after surfacing from a long dive. Deep, full, owned. Conversations resumed in awkward spurts. Eyes darted away when I met them. Some guests clapped softly, unsure of the etiquette for presidential praise of a sibling at a wedding. A few nodded with awkward reverence. One woman dabbed her eyes. I didn't engage. I sat there like a lighthouse, unmoving, letting the waves of their discomfort crash and pass. When Evelyn finally approached, her voice was quieter than usual. "I didn't know." "No," I said. "You didn't want to." Her lips parted, then closed again. She looked down at the broken glass at her feet, then back at me. It must have been terrifying. I considered that. It was. And also it was necessary. She nodded slowly, then looked at the guests, whispering and watching. "They'll never forget this." I met her eyes. "Neither will I." She reached for my hand. I let her hold it for a second. Just long enough to know it wasn't about forgiveness. It was about acknowledgement. When Liam finally came over, his voice was tight, his usual charm faltering. "So, that was unexpected." I tilted my head. "Was it? I didn't even know he knew who you were." "That makes two of us," I said. "But I guess that's what happens when someone bothers to read beyond the headline." He winced just barely. "You stole the spotlight, you know." "I didn't steal anything," I replied. "I earned every inch of it." He didn't argue. He just nodded, then left to rejoin the party, which now carried a strange undercurrent, a story shifting beneath them. I stayed a little longer, ate half a slice of cake, listened to a tipsy aunt, tried to remember what exactly a field medic does. But mostly I sat still, breathing, because for the first time in a very long time, I didn't have to prove anything. I didn't have to explain. I didn't have to fight to be seen. The president had spoken, and now they would remember. Not the uniform, not the rank, not even the medals, but the woman who rewrote doctrine and made them look twice. I had become the toast, without raising a glass. I didn't raise a glass, but I raised a line no one else dared cross, and Kandahar was where I bled for it. Not metaphorically, not emotionally, but literally in the heat-bleached dust of a village caught between two hells. It was supposed to be a sweep and evac mission. Civilian reports scattered IEDs and possible insurgent movement in the hills. Nothing unusual, except everything was. The intel was thin, the air was wrong, and the silence before the shot came too early. I remember the comms crackling. "No entry until perimeter is clear. Repeat, do not engage." And then the scream. Not a soldier's, not tactical, not an adult. A high-pitched wail, thin and jagged like a thread about to snap. I turned, instinctively saw the house more like a shack, half-collapsed smoke curling out like fingers asking for help. Two figures at the threshold, a boy, maybe 8, clutching a toddler who was sobbing so hard his body shook. The house was on fire. Ammunition from an earlier strike popped like evil popcorn. The perimeter wasn't clear. The order stood. But some lines don't wait for clearance. I ran. No backup, no permission, just boots over broken stone hearts slamming like a war drum. The heat kissed my face with cruel affection. I dove through the doorway just as the roof moaned under strain, grabbed the boy by the collar, the toddler under one arm. He wet himself. I didn't care. We made it 3 feet before the back wall gave in. Something sharp caught my shoulder. Something else caught my breath. I blacked out for 5 seconds, maybe 10, but I didn't let go. When I came to, a corporal was dragging me backward by the vest, shouting something about orders and chain of command and what the hell I was thinking. I couldn't answer. My mouth tasted like copper. But my arms still held those 2 bodies alive, crying scorched but whole. Later, in triage, while they debrided the burn on my leg and stitched the gash along my ribs, a lieutenant colonel came in. He didn't salute, didn't even sit, just said, "You disobeyed a direct order." I nodded. "Yes, sir. You jeopardized the unit." Another nod. "Yes, sir. You broke protocol." And I looked him in the eye and said, "Yes, sir. But not the children." He didn't respond. Just left the room. 3 days later, I was written up. Docked pay, scheduled for disciplinary review. My squad was split on me. Some called me reckless. Others handed me their rations in quiet solidarity. But none of that broke me. What almost did, was the note. Slipped under my cot like contraband. No signature, no rank. Just a strip of gauze with 6 words scribbled in ballpoint because of you 2 graves less. I stared at it until the corners curled. Then I folded it and tucked it into the pocket of my combat pants over my heart. A week after that, a major walked into the barracks with a laptop. "You might want to see this," he said. Someone had uploaded my helmet cam footage to Central Command. The full sequence sprint fire smoke scream, the collapse of the crawl, the blood. It wasn't clean, it wasn't heroic, but it was real, raw, and it travelled. First through our base, then the region, then somehow Washington. Policy review started, training doctrines shifted. They used words like ethical risk-taking and adaptive response. I didn't care for the jargon. I cared that next time someone heard a child cry behind a wall of fire, they might know there's room to move, not just obey. I wasn't promoted. I wasn't even mentioned in the debrief. But that footage, the heat, the breath, the tremble in my voice. As I said, "I've got you," it became curriculum, required viewing. My scar, my strike, my sentence. Not erased, rewritten. And in that tiny rewrite, the doctrine cracked. Just enough for someone else to breathe through. Just enough for truth to wedge its foot in the door. That's all I ever needed. Not applause, just oxygen. It wasn't applause I got next. It was a camera. The kind with a lens so long it made everyone straighten their backs, like it could capture not just your image, but your secrets. We were lined up on the back lawn of the reception venue, wedding photos, final group shots, the kind of thing you frame and forget. Most guests were still inside, full on cake and champagne, but someone had decided a formal shot with the president deserved daylight. And there he was again, the commander-in-chief, standing casually near the rose arbor, chatting with Liam about overseas investments like politics and mergers shared the same vocabulary. I stood off to the side, hands behind my back, breathing the way I'd been trained to slow, controlled present. A seagull circled overhead. I watched it distantly, amused by how free it looked compared to the corseted tension around me. The photographer, a young woman with black-rimmed glasses and a clipboard full of poses, began arranging people. Bride and groom centre parents flanking them. Siblings next. I stayed where I was. Edges were familiar to me. I didn't mind the cold of marginality anymore. It had become home. Then came the murmur, low and uncertain. "We're missing someone," she said. "Sergeant R. Monroe, my name." Well, the closest thing to it they'd allow spoken like it belonged in the room. I blinked. There was a beat where no one else moved. Then, the photographer looked directly at me, her gaze firm with quiet authority. She wasn't asking. "You should be centered," she said, voice hesitant but unwavering. Before I could respond, the president turned toward me. "That's correct," he said, gesturing toward the middle. "Highest commendation in the group stands center." That's not just military tradition, it's truth. The air changed. It always does when authority declares something inconvenient to be valid. There was a pause, a shift. Evelyn's mouth tightened, lips pressed into a line so fine it could have sliced glass. Liam looked at his shoes. Gregory cleared his throat like it might erase the moment rewrite the script. But the script had changed and I was the punctuation. I walked, not quickly, not triumphantly, just steadily. Past the gold-stitched gowns, the polished shoes, the manicured approval. I took my place between my brother and his bride. The hem of my uniform brushed her silk dress. She flinched almost imperceptibly. I didn't move. Neither did she. The photographer adjusted her lens. "Big smiles," she chirped. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. My presence wasn't a performance. I didn't pose. I stood, not as a daughter, not as a sister, but as someone who'd survived more than this family could fathom. When the shutter clicked, I imagined the flash burning through every assumption they'd ever made. Later, someone would look at that photo hung in some hallway, wedged between Christmas cards and framed degrees, and pause. "Who's that in the centre?" And someone else would have to answer. "That's Rachel, not our disappointment, not the difficult one, just Rachel, not liked, not forgiven, but seen." And for the first time, that was enough. The president lingered after the shoot. He made a quiet beeline toward me, bypassing Liam's outstretched hand. "Sergeant Monroe," he said, extending his own. "Your report on battlefield triage has already changed the way we train." I nodded once. It wasn't meant to change systems, just to keep people alive. He smiled. Sometimes the best systems start there. Then he leaned in, lowered his voice so only I could hear. "You stood alone when policy failed. That's courage most men only write about." And then he was gone, swept up by aides and headlines. I stayed still, hand tingling with the aftershock of being acknowledged by someone who didn't have to pretend. My mother hovered near the punch bowl, her hand shaking just enough to send ice cubes clinking against glass. She didn't approach. Not yet. Maybe not ever. And that was fine. For the first time, I didn't need to be the one to bridge the gap. I had always been the one to cross burning fields. Let them come if they dared. Later that evening, I passed the same framed mirror in the hall I used to sneak glances into as a child. I paused, looked, really looked. The reflection staring back wasn't softer, wasn't more acceptable, but it was whole. Finally, it was whole. I stood at the edge of the hall, my hands lightly folded dress uniform, still impeccable though the night was winding down. The glow of chandeliers shimmered against the brass of my medals, casting reflections onto the polished floor that looked almost like ghosts. Ghosts of the woman I had been. Ghosts of the girl they never truly saw. My breath was even, my shoulders no longer stiff with defense. I had spent most of my life bracing for the impact that never came until I learned the silence was its own collision. Now, I was whole. Finally, it was whole. And then she came. Evelyn Monroe, my mother. Her steps were hesitant, like the ground beneath her had shifted, and she didn't quite trust it anymore. She moved as though walking toward a cliff drawn but wary. Her face was pale lips pressed into a thin line. There was no wine glass in her hand, no pretense of confidence, just fingers trembling slightly like leaves caught in a quiet storm. She stopped in front of me and said nothing for a moment. Her gaze dropped not to my uniform this time, but to my eyes. It was the first time I felt her look at me, not through me, and that alone felt louder than any apology could have. Finally, she reached out. Her hand hovered near my sleeve just enough to feel the fabric, not enough to wrinkle it. Her voice, when it came, cracked like old paper. I didn't know. 3 words. Not grand, not poetic, not enough to undo years of silence, but enough to pause them. I waited. Let the moment breathe. Then said softly, "You never asked. It wasn't bitterness. Not anymore. Just a fact." Her eyes widened a little, not in surprise, more like recognition. Like the moment when headlights catch a deer too long still. "I thought you were just..." "Angry," she said, eyes glassy now. "So distant. I thought it was about us, that you were trying to hurt us." I tilted my head. "I was surviving Mom." "That's not the same thing." She flinched slightly at the word. Mom. It had been years since I called her that. We stood there, 2 women wrapped in history, separated by expectations and regret. Around us, the noise of the reception continued. Laughter, forks against plates, glasses clinking. But in our corner of the world, everything had gone still. "I didn't know," she repeated a little more to herself this time. "I didn't know what you'd been through, what it meant to carry people like that." She gestured vaguely at my medals, like they were stories written in braille she could never quite decipher. "It's not about the medals," I said. "It's about what they didn't take." She looked confused. "What do you mean?" I hesitated, then met her eyes. "Pain takes pieces of you. Every time. Every life you try to save. Every time you fail. It carves something out. These," I tapped one of the medals lightly, "these just mean there's still something left." Silence again. Then, in the quietest voice I'd ever heard from her, she asked, "Do you still have pieces that did it?" Not the question itself, but the fact that she cared to ask it. I nodded. "Enough." She blinked, rapidly wiped at the corner of one eye, like she was chasing away dust. "I was wrong," she said, "about everything, about you, about what mattered." I didn't rush to comfort her. That wasn't what this was. This wasn't absolution. It was recognition, and that mattered more. "You weren't built to understand," I said, "but maybe you can choose to try now." She looked up at me, and for once there was no defense in her posture, no cardigan stiff with control, just a woman looking at her daughter and realizing she'd missed the miracle of her survival. She nodded once. "Can I sit with you?" I motioned to a side table. "Only if you don't mind silence." "I've had enough of the wrong kind," she said. We sat. For 5 whole minutes we didn't speak. Just sat, breathing the same air, no longer strangers. And in that stillness, I understood something reconciliation doesn't need fireworks. Sometimes it's just sitting still long enough for someone to see you without blinking. I didn't forgive her. That wasn't what she asked for. What she gave me was space. And what I gave her was presence. And maybe, for the first time in our long, jagged story, that was enough. I stepped out into the night again, away from the slow, simmering discomfort of chandeliers and carefully curated music. The laughter behind me sounded muffled not just by walls, but by years. Years of not belonging. Years of being something else, someone else, so I could survive. My fingers reached instinctively into the inside pocket of my uniform jacket. The fabric was worn, now softened by time and heat and salt. I pulled out the small, crumpled piece of foil. It glinted faintly under the patio light. The lollipop was still there. Red. Slightly flattened on one side. Jasmine had handed it to me with those ash-streaked fingers, like she was giving me something sacred. And, in a way, she had. It had melted and reformed with the heat of Kandahar and the cold of Walter Reed. And through it all, it had stayed with me, not as a keepsake, as a compass. I unwrapped it slowly, carefully. The crackle of the foil sounded louder than the music inside. I didn't put it in my mouth yet. I just held it, letting the air cool the sugar. It was sticky in the centre, a little warped. Perfect, really. You always did have a thing for the dramatic, came a voice behind me. I turned. Ava Monroe, my cousin 5 years younger, was once obsessed with figure skating and horse books. I remembered her watching me at family gatherings, wide-eyed, never speaking much. Now she was in a mauve dress, barefoot heels, dangling from one hand, a glass of something bubbly in the other. "Is that a war lollipop?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Something like that," I said. She stepped closer, the gravel crunching beneath her feet. "I didn't think you'd come tonight. I wasn't sure I would either. Was it worth it?" Her voice wasn't mocking, just curious. I looked down at the lollipop, then back at the glowing windows of the reception hall. "Yeah, it was." She tilted her head. Even with the way they acted, I exhaled through my nose, especially because of it. Ava sat down on the edge of a planter box, pulling her dress around her knees. "I used to think you hated all of us, that you just didn't care." "I didn't hate you," I said quietly. "I hated the way I vanished whenever I was here." She was silent for a moment, then nodded. "That makes sense. I think I see you better now." I didn't respond. Not right away. I let that sit. "Let it be enough. You know," she added, twirling her glass, "when you left for the army, everyone said you'd never last. That you were trying to be something you're not." I smiled faintly. They were half right. I wasn't trying to be something I'm not. I was trying to stop pretending I was something I never was. Ava laughed, a short surprise burst. "God. Yeah, that tracks." We sat there in companionable silence. I finally popped the lollipop into my mouth. It was sweeter than I remembered. Maybe because I'd earned it now, not just from war, but from surviving this place. These people. Ava glanced over at me. "Do you ever think about not coming back? Like just staying away forever?" I didn't even hesitate. "All the time. So why don't you?" "I thought about that, because I'm not here for them anymore. I come back to remind myself of who I survived, and who I became because of it." She let out a slow breath. "That's a lot heavier than the toast Liam gave." I laughed. It startled both of us. "Yeah, he was lighter on trauma." Ava stood and dusted off her dress. "Well, for what it's worth, I'm glad you showed up. Like this, in the uniform, with the stories, even with the lollipop." I stood too. "You didn't need me to soften it." "No," she said. "I think it's better real." I nodded. She hesitated, then reached out and gave me the gentlest hug, more a shoulder press than anything else, but it felt sincere. After she went back inside, I stayed a little longer. The lollipop was down to a sliver now, but I kept it in my mouth anyway. Let it last. Let it remind me that one person, one girl, one you are brave, could eclipse a lifetime of being overlooked. Because Jasmine had seen me. Not for medals or missions or defiance, just as I was. And maybe that was enough. The classroom was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes not from silence, but from attention. Fresh recruits sat in rows, their notebooks open, their faces, tense with the kind of nerves that come when you know this isn't just another class. This is the one that might save someone else's life. I stood at the front, hands clasped behind my back, uniform, crisp, voice steady. It had taken years to land here, not just on the schedule, not just at Walter Reed, but here in a space where what I knew, what I lived through, was finally considered expertise, not exception. "Chest wounds," I said, clicking the remote as an image of a battlefield thoracotomy lit up the screen. "They don't wait for you to feel ready." You either know what to do or someone dies. There's no grey space. A hand shot up in the third row. A young man, maybe 20, brown eyes, too white hair, too perfect. I nodded. Yes. He cleared his throat, nervous but determined. Were you the one in that video, the one from Kandahar? The rescue with the 2 kids? The room shifted. A few students glanced up sharply. Others held their breath. I felt the old reflex twitch in my chest, the instinct to deflect, to shrink, to redirect. But I didn't. Not this time. Yes, I said, that was me. The room exhaled. A few heads nodded, the kind of nod that holds more than respect. It holds understanding. Or the beginnings of it. The young man looked down at his notes, then back up. And you still came back to teach? I smiled. I came back because people forget that bravery doesn't end with the battlefield. It begins again every time you walk into a room and believe you still matter. That earned me a few blinks, a few scribbles. I moved on. We went through hemorrhage control, airway trauma, and triage prioritization. I watched them practice on dummies fumbling but trying, and I remembered myself. Not the version they saw in the video, but the girl who once sat alone in a backyard, wondering if being brave would ever be enough to be seen. I walked between rows, corrected a wrist angle, here adjusted a tourniquet there. And then I saw it, one student, wrapping a wound too loosely. I knelt beside him. If you wrap like that, I said, your patient bleeds out before help even comes. He looked embarrassed. Sorry, I thought it was tight enough. In combat, I said quietly, thinking isn't enough. You need to know, pressure saves lives. Hesitation kills. He nodded, redoing the wrap. Another student, a woman with sharp eyes and a steadier grip, smirked. So, you'd fail us over a loose wrap? Absolutely, I said, standing up. If you can't stop blood from pouring out of a limb, what are you doing in this room? That earned a few nervous laughs. What if we save the kid but not the leg, one of them joked. Then I said, you tell them the truth and you live with it, because it's better than burying a child. The room quieted again. I let the silence settle. Not heavy, not awkward, just real. At the end of the lesson, I turned to the whiteboard and picked up a marker. Without thinking, I wrote the words that had been forming in my chest since Jasmine handed me that sticky, defiant piece of candy. To save others, we must first believe we're worth saving. I capped the marker and stepped back. Someone in the back took a photo. I didn't stop them. The bell rang. Chairs scraped. Voices returned. But a few lingered, looking at the board. Not me. And that was fine. I gathered my things slowly, the way you do when you're not ready to leave the moment just yet. As I reached for my binder, a voice, soft, sincere, spoke up near the door. Mom, I turned. A girl, young, pale, freckles and nerves. I just wanted to say, I think I understand why you came back. To teach, I mean. I tilted my head. Why? She shrugged. Because maybe someone like me needs to believe we can be more than just what the world expects. I didn't respond right away. I just nodded. And for the first time, really, truly, I believed it too. I walked out of the classroom into the fading light. The hallway buzzed with voices, future medics, talking about techniques, timelines and trauma. I moved through it quietly, unnoticed. But not invisible. Never again. Not after Jasmine. Not after everything. Because I had finally come home to myself. And that, at last, was enough. So if you've ever walked into a room and felt too loud, too different, too much, or maybe just unseen, know this. Your worth isn't something others are qualified to measure. It's not found in applause or permission. It's in your pulse, your breath, the quiet moments you chose to keep going. You don't need a battlefield to be brave. Sometimes bravery is just sitting with your own story and still showing up. If this story found a place in your heart, if it reminded you of your own fight, your silence, your breath, I hope you stay. Subscribe, share. Tell me who saw you or who didn't. Because of stories like Rachel's, they don't end. They echo.